And here is Pete Newell, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dick. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. 3 years ago, I had the distinct privilege of presenting one of the greatest of the great, Oscar Robertson. This year, I have the opportunity of presenting a man that we felt was one of our greatest in the West. In fact, we call him Mr. Basketball, Lloyd Leith. Lloyd Leith, basketball in its early inception was a very provincial game, and many of our great Western people never became known in the Middle West and in the East. And I'm sure the same is true of the great Eastern, Middle Western people weren't known generally out in the West. But Lloyd Leith was a giant to us. Lloyd Leith was a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, 1927. He went into coaching, and went into teaching, and for 45 years he was a teacher in the San Francisco school system. And about 40 of those years he was a coach, a great teacher, and took a great pride in his teaching, and was considered and is considered one of the great coaches in the history of high school basketball in the Bay Area. And for 25 of those years, he was our official. He was the #1 official in the West, and even to this day, when you talk about Western officials, you start with Lloyd Leith, and there's a drop, and we've had many great officials, and some of them are here, disciples of Lloyd, just to honor this great man that is being honored tonight. And after his officiating, he became a supervisor of officials for the Pac-10, and then worked with Johnny Nakatola in the NBA. Now, Lloyd Leith was particularly, well, let me just go back a little. In spite of what you may read, and in spite of what you may think, especially in this part of the country, basketball did not start and end with UCLA. We feel, out in the West, that the seat of basketball always has been in the Bay Area. Our many great teams, the University of San Francisco teams, the Stanford team that won the NC2A, Cal had some fine teams. We had AAU teams that were champions, and we had great players out there. Some of the greatest players in basketball that are enshrined in the Hall of Fame. Hank Lucetti, Bill Russell, Jim Pollard, another player, Bob Farrick. These were great players. As great as our teams were, and as great as our players were, our officiating was at a standard even above that, respect. And I don't think I've ever seen an official with more respect than Lloyd had. To give you an example, we had a great rivalry on the West Coast, and this goes back to the 30s. In fact, I played at a little Jesuit school, Loyola University, down in L.A., and those days you didn't travel out of your area. And I remember going up to play in the Bay Area, which was where Lloyd was the top official. In fact, he was known all over. And those days, when you were traveling, you'd say, who's officiating? Well, you had no idea. They say Smith and Jones. You didn't know who Smith and Jones. You knew they were homers. And so you accepted it. But when we found out that Lloyd Leith was working that game, we felt we really arrived. We must be a pretty good team to have an official of the, and Lloyd was a young official at the time, but this was the esteem in which he was held. And we had this rivalry I was referring to between Cal and USC, and two real great men were coaches of those two institutions. One, Sam Barry, who was a Hall of Fame member. Both of these men, incidentally, were very close friends of Claire B., sitting right in front of us here. And Nibs Price. And they were really rivals, not bitter rivals, but real rivals. And then after the game, they'd go out and have a few belts and lie to each other. But this was the way coaches were in those days. Well, Lloyd is working this game. And you've heard about the University of California at Berkeley, I'm sure. You've read about it. And their gymnasium is something like what you've read in the paper and you've seen on television as far as the turmoil and well, it was a very tough court for a visiting team, very tough for an official. And they're having this really important game, and they get right down to the wire, and Lloyd calls a foul on a Cal guy. And the fans, the students there, are really tough. I'm sure you've seen the students at Berkeley on television. And mostly they're in political issues. Bill, you know about what I'm talking about here. But every now and then, they'd get out and they'd really root for the basketball team. And they're a little partisan. And they weren't above playing catch across the court with a tennis ball during the course of the game. In fact, they invented a very famous student play at that time. In those days, you used to shoot a gun at the end of the half and at the end of the game. And you could just put your clock on it about 3 times during the year. When they'd shoot a gun, a dead duck would fall right in the middle of the court. And so this was a kind of a situation. Well, anyway, Lloyd called the foul. And the stands, they're starting to throw things out on the court, and he let the player shoot the foul, and he missed it. So he put him back there again, and he missed it again. In the meantime, the fans keep going and going and going. He let him shoot 12 times. He let him shoot until he made it. And, of course, Cal coach Nibs Price was a little upset at first. Well, anyway, just to show you the esteem that Lloyd was held in, that after the game, instead of being mad, the Cal coach, because the opponent was allowed to shoot 12 consecutive fouls, finally made one, they invited Lloyd to have a beer with him after the game. And I tell you, that's a height of respect that an official can get. And when he left officiating, he was, as I say, our outstanding West Coast official. He worked 16 years in the NC2A, worked final championship game between Kansas State and Kentucky. He was also, at that time, before the war, the AAU basketball was what the NBA almost is today in terms of respect as a basketball conference. And he was invited many times to work the final game there. And I'd say that the outstanding evidence of his esteem among coaches was the Kansas-Oklahoma State game. Fog Allen was you heard referred to earlier, was the outstanding coach for Kansas, and Henry Iva for Oklahoma State. And these two powers would meet, and they could never agree on officials, that is, from the local area. And Lloyd invariably was invited from the West Coast, which was unheard of at that time, to bring him all the way back to the Middle West to work that game. And that gives you an idea of what kind of an official he was. When he finished his officiating, he became the commissioner of officials for the Pac-10 conference, which at that time was Pacific Coast Conference. And soon after he got the job, he called me up and asked, how about coming up and having lunch with me? I was coaching at the time, and I said, fine, Lloyd. So we have lunch, and he's got this new job, and he wants to get some feel of how he's going to approach it. Well, you know, it's very easy to give advice. It's sometimes difficult to take it. So I'm giving him advice, and one of the things I told him, I said, Lloyd, it's going to be hard to do what I'm going to say, but if you're going to be a good commissioner, I think if you can do this, you'll be an outstanding commissioner. I said, after the game, go into the dressing rooms, immediately after the game. Now, you go first into the winning dressing room, because the last thing a winning coach thinks about is the official. So he'd be kind of happy to see he won the game, and, you know, he'll, slap you in the back and the whole thing. And then go from there into the losers' dressing room. And the first thing a losing coach thinks about is the official. And it's very difficult to do that. But he did it. And he'd go in there and he would take the venom and all the frustration and pent-up feeling that the losing coach had. Coach get it all out of his system. And he never had a problem. He never had a problem, this man. He had the courage to go in there and take it, not argue with the emotionally upset coach. And I thought that any man that can do that has to be a real man. And he was a real man. And he helped John Nakatola in the NBA for 7 years, and he made a real contribution, as John so well knows, to the NBA. And just in closing here, in our life, we'd all like to leave something behind us, an imprint of something that people remember us for. And I want to tell you, this man left an imprint. the quality of officiating, the esteem and the respect that the Bay Area officiating has and has had is directly responsible to the work that Lloyd Leith did in bringing this great level of excellence to our officiating of the West Coast. Now I'd like to introduce here Frank McIntyre, who is a disciple. Frank is presently the Pac-10 Commissioner of Officials, and he is going to introduce Lloyd's family, his wonderful family that is here, and he's also going to tell you a little more about Lloyd. Frank.
Thank you, Pete. Lloyd Leith, by virtue of his election and by the authority vested in me by the trustees of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, I have the distinguished honor to enshrine him as a contributor in the Basketball Hall of Fame with all the rights and privileges. Frank? Thank you very much.
Members of the head table, members of the Hall of Fame, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this opportunity to tell you that on behalf of the West Coast, and particularly our beautiful city of San Francisco, just how proud and what a privilege it is this evening for me to be able to represent one of the dearest friends that I've ever met in my life. A gentleman that, ironically, was a teacher at the high school I was in, a man that I got to know away from and long before I get into officiating, and after I once got into the officiating picture, I found out what a real gentleman and what a real outstanding person this man was. He was a man that truly, how can I best tell you about Lloyd? Lloyd was the type of person that anything he tackled, anything he went into, he was outstanding in. He was an outstanding educator, a coach. He was the dean of officials, as Pete has just said, for 25 years in our Bay Area, the entire West Coast. You could go on and on about stories. He had a wonderful sense of humor. Listening to Pete here, and I hadn't thought of this story in a long time, it was one of his favorites. He had a very, very difficult ball game one night down at the sports arena, UCLA and USC, and they were pounding that backboard, and Lloyd was whistling, and all of a sudden one of the youngsters grabs his eye and he hollers, "Time out, coach, time!" And with that, Lloyd, ever vigilant, rushes up to the youngster. "What's the matter?" He says, "Mr. Leith, I had a glass eye and it got knocked out." And Lloyd stood back, "A glass eye?" He said, "Wait a minute." So they all got down on their hands and knees and they started looking under the first row there in the sports arena, and all of a sudden, Lloyd, ever sharp with that great eye he had, finds it, picks it up, spits on it, wipes it, helps put it back in, and he's ready to start the ball game. All of a sudden, he said, wait a minute, son, come here." He said, "What in the world would you do if you got hit in the other eye and you went totally blind?" He said, "Think nothing of it, Mr. Leith." He said, "I'd go out and get myself a white cane, a striped shirt, a whistle, and join your association." I think Pete can attest to the sincerity, the dedication, the rare integrity, the techniques. But in those days, he worked very, very closely with Johnny Bunn. And when John would put on the clinics up and down the coast, and Lloyd would handle the officiating manual end of it, between the two of them, any place they went, up and down that Pacific coast, they had a full house. And I think the excellence, as I'll point out a little later this evening, is one of the gentlemen that's here with us tonight. San Francisco, despite all of this publicity you hear, is really a wonderful town. And as I go back, and I was thinking here, I had to change a few of my thoughts on the excellent talk that Pete gave here, but I went back to the fact that very quickly in my mind, I come up with at least 12 of his students that went through his school of training in officiating that ended up working one or more of the NCAA finals throughout the years. We do take a great deal of pride, and I've been with the Pac-10 conference now for a period of 18 years, and many of the philosophies, and sometimes when you're dealing with the egos of coaches and officials, I've reached back for the advice that my very dear friend Lloyd Leith has given to me. I think one of the outstanding features of this trip here, for me particularly, in representing Lloyd, was you can read about the Hall of Fame, you can talk about it, and as I went through the halls the other day and I thought about the thousands of coaches and players and officials that play this very wonderful game of basketball, and to think that our wonderful friend Lloyd is one of the members of the 138 elite people that is in this Hall of Fame. In his last days, as we sat together and we talked about this wonderful Hall of Fame, and I know how badly he wanted to be a member of it, I couldn't help but realize and feel that the honor and the reality is here, and I know how proud, and I know he's up there, and I know he knows what's going on here, and I know how proud he is to be a member of this wonderful group. I would like to take a minute here this evening and introduce the people at Table A here that took the time to come here to honor Lloyd. It'll only take me a second, and I ask you all please to sit down, and if you'll stand when I finish, we can let the folks acknowledge you. We have a member here, Mr. Harry Amy, who spent 45 years working in the San Francisco Unified School System with Lloyd. Great friends, coached across the court with one another, never lost that friendship, and traveled with Lloyd on many of his Bay Area top college games, and he's representing our San Francisco Unified School District. Next, we have, as I said, in excellence, a man that's very quiet about his record in officiating. But I think if Lloyd could have adopted a son, this was a man that he would have chosen. He was one of the real outstanding officials. He had the privilege, and he owes all of his excellence and his abilities to Lloyd again. He worked 4 national NCAA championship finals. Mr. Bill Basinius sitting at the table. Another young man that's making his mark on the West Coast with us, and his excellence in, as a clinician. Again, started with Lloyd, studied with him, and they discussed, and he's currently the supervisor of the Far West Conference. He observes for me in the Pac-10 conference, and he is now the clinician for eyeball on the West Coast, Mr. Ray Dal Pagetto. And of course, the people that Lloyd loved most, while I think we'd have to put his preferences in this manner, of course, his family, the friends, and then, of course, basketball was his love right up to the day he passed away. His very lovely wife, Marge, is here. Their lovely daughter, Lori, and her husband, David Biles. And I think one of the proudest moments, a short time before Lloyd passed on, was that he saw the Leith heritage carried on in the coaching profession. Lori was runner-up for the state championship. She was a coach in the junior colleges in the state of California, and for one of the outstanding girl basketball teams. And of course, he saw this, and this made him exceedingly happy. One other very lovely person at the table, the widow of Frank Bowtie Walsh, who was one of the outstanding promoters in our Bay Area. Many of you that come out here, I was talking to Jerry about his visit to the Cow Palace. He was the originator pioneer that went ahead and started this wonderful tradition out there. Margaret Walsh. Will you all please stand and be recognized, please? In closing, I simply want to say that I think one of my fondest wishes and my thoughts this evening, sitting here listening to Pete, and so many thoughts going through my mind, would be to have this wonderful gentleman here. But as I said earlier, knowing Lloyd and being with him all these years, he's up there looking down and getting a real kick out of all of this. And thank you very, very much for this wonderful privilege.